Do you all know about the blessing the animals today? 3 o'clock. Anybody coming? I think there are multiple Vishlas coming today. My wife is bringing her Vishla friends. You know what 5 o'clock is tonight? Evensong, yes. Choir sings evening prayer. It's quite beautiful. It's what they did a lot of when they were in England for a couple weeks this summer, so they should be particularly good and focused tonight. I'm filling time as people walk in the room. I can go a long time or a little bit. I will, because you're early, I'm going to tell you a joke. How about that? Hey, you're not filming yet? Oh, whatever. It's not dirty. It's not risque. I don't make fun of any Episcopal clergy. A priest and a lawyer walk into a bakery. And the lawyer looks around shrewdly, grabs 3 freshly baked buns right off the tray, sticks them in his pocket. He said, "Look at the great skill it took for me to steal these buns. The owner didn't even see. He'll never know. I'll get away with it." The priest replies, "That's just stupid, simple theft. Let me show you a real miracle." So the priest calls out to the owner, "Mr. Baker, let me show you something. I'm going to show you a miracle." So the baker said, "Okay, I'm game. What do you think?" And he said, "Hand me a bun." So the baker hands him a bun. He takes it, goes right over to the homeless guy, outside the door. "Here you go." "Oh, thanks, Father." Eats it. "All right. Hand me another bun." Guy goes out, hands another bun away, then a third time, and the baker's getting a little bit annoyed, but okay, so, "Father, I've given you 3 of my buns. Where is the miracle you promised?" And the priest says, "Look in the pocket of the lawyer for the miracle." That was thanks to Ruth Becker, Lutheran pastor. Now, as everybody's gathering, I do want to ask a question of you. I've been asked once, why are there no prayer books or hymnals in the pews at Calvary Church today? Because the Tree of Life congregation is here observing their high holidays, celebrating their high holidays, and they have loads of prayer books and things. And so to stop confusion, which happened before, we removed all of them. They're sitting in a room somewhere, so all the Tree of Life things are out, just to make it easier on the sextons and everybody else. That's why we have today a bulletin, like we do at 11 every week, that has all the hymns and readings in there, so it's a so-called full-text bulletin. That's a temporary thing just simply for today to help provide good hospitality for them. Did you all figure that out already? It's a very smart group here at Calvary. So we're getting our money's worth out of Aaron today. He's preaching 3 times, 8, 9, and 11, and leading this. And remember, he is the, what's your official title as rabbi at Ohav Shalom?
Rabbi.
Rabbi. I thought it was fancier than that, just the rabbi at Ohav Shalom, and led high holiday services there, and so was able to be with us here. Would you open us in prayer and then talk about Rosh Hashanah?
Sure. Thank you. Good to be with you again. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. We thank you, God, for providing us texts that guide our lives as we plumb them for meaning. Okay, so before I moved into Pittsburgh, I lived in Philadelphia, and when I headed to Philadelphia, I was encouraged to watch the movie Rocky because it's all about Philadelphia. It was the best picture of 1981, just to humble us a bit about how much time has passed. And there's a great scene in the movie where Rocky goes to pick up Adrian, who's going to be his girlfriend, picks her up for a first date, a dinner date, and he knocks on the door of her South Philadelphia row house where she lives with her brother Paulie, and Paulie's going to become Rocky's manager. Paulie answers the door. Rocky's standing on the front stoop, and he says, "Rocky, what are you doing here?" He says, "I'm here to pick up Adrian for dinner." He says, "Rocky, it's Thanksgiving." And you see behind him a table laden with the Thanksgiving fare. He says, "Rocky, it's Thanksgiving." And Rocky says, "To you it's Thanksgiving, to me it's Thursday." Because he has no one with whom to celebrate the holiday. So for you, this past week was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. For the Jewish community, it was Rosh Hashanah. And on Rosh Hashanah, which is the Jewish New Year, we traditionally celebrate, or Rosh Hashanah, the conceit of Rosh Hashanah is that what we're celebrating is the creation of the world. The idea is, and if you remember we spoke last week about calendars, that at some point, I don't know, maybe in the 7th century or so, the rabbis determined that we need a calendar, and we're going to figure out what day it is or assign a date to today and to tomorrow such that we'll know that we can make plans for next week. We're going to add up all the dates that we know about and all the times in the Bible that are described as lengths of years, what have you, and we're going to go back to the day on which, in the book of Genesis, God says, "Let there be light." And we're going to start counting forward from that moment. And so in the Jewish calendar, such that this year is 5,785, much like in our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, it's 2024. What the Jewish calendar is counting back to is the day of creation, or when creation began. Now, we have to suspend disbelief. It's not that Jews believe the world is actually less than 6,000 years old, but for the purpose of calendaring and assigning dates to days as they move forward, we need a starting point, and Rosh Hashanah celebrates the birthday of the world, or the moment when God says, as described in Genesis, "Let there be light," and then the 6 days of creation begin to unfold, and that's what the New Year is a celebration of. But over time, in the Midrashic, remember Midrash and the rabbinic interpretive tradition, other themes have grown up to be also assigned to Rosh Hashanah.
What's Midrash?
Oh, Midrash, sorry. Midrash, anyone help us remember? What is Midrash? Midrash is the process by which we read a text and essentially plumb it for meaning. Lidrosh means to explore or to investigate. And so Midrash becomes both the act of doing that, engaging the text. So when the text says, in the beginning, God said, "Let there be light," does God really have vocal cords? Does God really say anything? What does it mean to hear God's voice? All of those conversations which grow out of the idea that God said something is the process of Midrash. So any of those conversations, right, when we read about God being anthropomorphized in any particular way, or if there's a gap in the text such that it invites us to add some interpretation or some backstory. In some cases, they can become rather involved, and they become sort of like what we call fan fiction. We've talked about this before, right? Where you write a contemporaneous story, or you give the background, or you give the insight. What was someone imagining? What was going on for them? That's not actually in the text. You're reading between the lines.
Let me say something that is not immediately obvious to most Christians. Do we do that in the Christian faith, what he's talking about? Yes. How? We call it interpreting the Scripture. That's absolutely true. We do that. But particularly in the, depending on what strain or branch of Christianity you're talking about, Roman Catholicism, Presbyterian, Lutheran, Anglican, Episcopal, whatever, it tends to be different in how that is done. I would call it more straight interpretation. The very earliest were in Alexandria and Antioch, the interpretive schools. One was literal, exactly what it says. There's a parallel within Judaism of that. And the other was metaphorical. Well, what does it mean to say God spoke? Or who is God? And so on. And then it's branched out. What we don't really have, at least I'll say in my opinion, Midrash becomes, as Aaron was saying, almost like fan fiction. There's a really cool story in Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, and people love it so much, they'll write their own stories within that universe to fill it out. We don't really have that. The closest you could get is so-called Christian fiction, if you go to Barnes & Noble, but that's something else entirely. Let me say something so I don't get defrocked. I need to be precise. Within Christianity, we are not as playful with the biblical text as Judaism historically has been. Is that fair?
That's fair.
We just don't do it that way. So sometimes when we like, oh my God, you can say that about the Bible. We've been saying that a very long time before you guys even existed. To imagine what it would be like, and it could be God's not always the hero sometimes. Right. Or it flips things around, or I do that quite a bit. because of my immersion within this new Jewish life of what was the role, what was this person thinking in the story that's extra biblical outside of the Bible, but to fill that out. Well, the woman at the well with Jesus, what was she thinking? What was her background? It's fleshing it out in a way to see ourselves in the story. And I think that's what's really going on within Midrash, is to look at something from 1,000 different angles and see yourself in it. And we do that as Christians to a limited degree, but nothing like the Midrash of just imagining new stories. Do they have the same level, Midrash, of canonical, official, formal authority as the Torah would?
The answer, no. No. However, that's
the most Jewish thing he could have said. No, but however.
So that's true. That's true. Midrash, which is both the process and then is the name that's given to this body of literature. This genre is called Midrash. The process of creating it also called Midrash. It's not considered canonical, but neither is it really possible for a Jew to read the text absent a familiarity with or a lens that is midrashic, if you will. So for instance, I just had a lecture this last week, and it had never occurred to me. It was about lightning, this subject that was being discussed, and the story of Ben Franklin with the kite, with the key, and right? It turns out that didn't actually happen. It never occurred to me that it didn't actually happen. I know that with lots of biblical stories, of course, but I never queried this story as to whether it was really true. We sort of have a sense that George Washington and the cherry tree, not necessarily true. We don't have any record of that. But somehow it never occurred to me about the Ben Franklin and the kite with the key. That said, when we think of Ben Franklin, or when we think of George Washington, or we think of these stories as part of how we understand American history, such that George Washington's story, The Cherry Tree, is about integrity, and Ben Franklin's about imagination and innovation. These are qualities we like to assign to American exceptionalism, that kind of idea. So they inform us. And so when you think of the first or 16th president of the United States, or Ben Franklin or others, you may have these kinds of stories that inform it, right? It's no longer possible to think about George Washington and not consider the cherry tree. Sort of like in a courtroom where someone says something, the objection is made, it's sustained, and everyone's supposed to ignore that. Well, you can't quite ignore it once you've heard it. And so Midrash then informs what's going on, right? How we read that. In that, with that understanding about that Midrashic permission, that is to say, the license that we have to make interpretations, the idea about the world coming into being when God said, "Let there be light," and Rosh Hashanah celebrating that moment, other meanings have also been layered on top of it. That is to say, what we mean by beginnings, or what actually began, or implicit in beginning something, or other qualities, such that Rosh Hashanah, which is celebrated on the first day of the Hebrew month of Tishrei, that's not important. What's significant is that on the 10th day of the same month of Tishrei, we have a holiday called Yom Kippur. And they're usually paired, Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and this 10-day period is called Yamim Noraim, the days of awe, which is to say that with the starting gun of Rosh Hashanah, and technically the starting gun begins some days before, because the month leading up is also to sort of get ready for Rosh Hashanah and for this period of time. With the onset of Rosh Hashanah, we embark upon a 10-day period that culminates with Yom Kippur, and in that span of week and a half, those 10 days, we're talking about the beginning of the world, and we're talking about making atonement, which is asking for forgiveness, making things right. We're going to talk about those themes next week. But as a result, because the 10 days are framed by the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and their themes, the themes themselves have sort of blended together, such that Rosh Hashanah, while it's the celebration of the creation of the world, is also the onset of this period of introspection and reflection. And so the idea of using this season as an opportunity to reflect on the ways in which we have fallen short of our ideals becomes part of what we mean by the Rosh Hashanah season.
So here's something very important to keep in mind. You are now hearing you are an ordained rabbi, correct? The official version of what Rosh Hashanah to Yom Kippur, what that means, what they are. So, for fun, because I like to do this stuff, we had lots of Jewish people here this week. So I said, look, I'm taking an informal survey. I know what the rabbi is going to say. What is Rosh Hashanah? Oh, it's, why don't you ask the rabbi that? I said, I'm asking you. Well, what does it mean to you? It means family. Like, oh, well, we get together, we have a meal. And it means challah, the round bread. And it means apples and honey. Why in the world would it mean apples and honey?
So apples and honey have become the symbolic food of the holiday. Why an apple with a creation story? Because it shows up in Adam and Eve story in the garden, and it's healthy, and it's sort of the symbol of, we know an apple a day keeps the doctor away, right? Apple becomes sort of symbolic of all kinds of things, but essentially health, and the honey is sweetness. So the idea of a healthy, sweet year is how it is we get.
Have a healthy, sweet year. And how do they observe that? Practically speaking, Tree of Life anyway, gives out little bit of honey candy, which are probably on sale early for Halloween, I'm guessing, but also those little mini bears full of honey, and give those out as have a sweet new year. And okay, that's neat. What else does it mean to you? Forgiveness. And people quickly run out and then, well, here's the woman who taught Sunday school, and so she gave me the textbook answer. But think about that. If I were to ask you, and this woman then did, what's Easter? If you ask the average person, everyone here is above average. We all know that. But everybody in here, but the average person in America, what is Easter? What would they say? Easter bunny, candy, that's the one time a year I go to church, maybe Christmas. You get to dress up, there's a family event. It's dinner with maybe ham. And is the Easter bunny resurrected if he sees his shadow? How does that go? It's like we mix up all these different ideas in our head. Christmas, what is that? Kind of the birth of Christ. Santa Claus, winter holiday like it is in schools now or whatever it is. We talked about that briefly last week. It's everything to do with peace and joy and love and feeling generous, and lots of movies and music go along with that. And the Christian version, most would say, I get this a lot. Oh God, I almost said that. I'm among the most religious people in my family. All the other ones who tend to be Baptist, and they will say, happy birthday, Jesus, which is perfectly fine. I don't think that's what's happening. That's not what our tradition teaches. We don't say it's Jesus' birthday. We'll say this is a celebration of the incarnation. So it's not just a birthday. God becoming a human being in Jesus Christ to enter the world, to embrace it fully, to redeem it, to reconcile all of creation. That's a lot more than saying Santa Claus and go to church on midnight mass. That's the textbook answer. But if you ask most people what is Christmas or Easter, they'll give you some more or less churchy version of what I just said. So remember, too, when we're talking about Rosh Hashanah, how a regular synagogue goer would experience it, or temple goer, is not necessarily how the rabbi or the priest experience these things. Something else I'll tell you that was mind-blowing for me, that I've gotten acclimated to, but it's really important to understand. How many people are in this room right now? 35, 40, somewhere in that range? How many are in a normal synagogue in America on a Friday night, the main service at Road of Shalom? Road of Shalom, our neighbor down on 5th Avenue, huge building. Was it 1,500 seats?
Oh, the sanctuary.
The sanctuary seats.
1,100.
1,100. So it's a rounder version of Calvary. Seats 1,100. How many are there on a Friday night?
A dozen, 2 dozen.
A dozen? Like, wait, what? So how many people go to church in the synagogue on a Friday night, the main service? 12 to 20, somewhere in there. Is that relatively typical of a synagogue in America? Reform or conservative? Yeah. So wait a second, how do they do church Like we do church by Sunday morning, education time, all the worship stuff, and then things like blessing the animals or evensong. They don't construct their world that way. So another really important piece, and this is an outsider looking in, how many people show up on a Friday night at Rodif for the first, I'm sorry, not Friday night, but for our first night of Rosh Hashanah?
Oh, much bigger numbers.
Hundreds?
Hundreds.
Hundreds. So this is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, our Christmas and Easter wrapped up all together in terms of participation of the community. And so this is the only, is that fair? Is this the only time, maybe a wedding or funeral, but where people show up in big numbers to come to worship?
Right. So we have 2-day-a-year Jews, and sort of colloquially, the same way there are 2-day-a-year Christians. Let me say this also. The academic reason for Rosh Hashanah is, as I've explained, the creation of the world. That's the idea. Other themes have been appended on it. But what becomes essential is that we need a way of understanding the story in order to make it sticky, right? That's just not an historical event alone, but that will be meaningful or resonate in our respective lives so that it actually has some play, right? It actually adheres. And so we work from the theme of the world being created to the notion of beginnings, and so it's an opportunity to imagine ourselves being recreated, or the opportunity or responsibility that we have to take this opportunity to begin anew. The way couples might renew their vows on an anniversary, or you might use your own birthday to say, well, this year I'm going to be committed to this. And you use an otherwise ordinary moment. To you it's Thanksgiving, to me it's Thursday. For you it's your birthday, to me it's Sunday, right? We all have these special moments. And then corporately, as a community, we do something very similar. We're going to use this holiday as the start of something new, or an opportunity to reflect on how we want to be better people, or whatever the theme may be beyond the historical event. And in that spirit, the notion, this is back to the Midrashic fan fiction tradition, other events have been ascribed to this day. So I'm going to speak of it in my sermon, that there is a tradition from the 5th century that suggests that Rosh Hashanah is not the birthday of the world per se. This tradition suggests that happened 6 days prior, but in point of fact on Rosh Hashanah, it was the creation of humanity. It was the creation of Adam, the first human being. Now I refer to that in the sermon as hermeneutical chutzpah, which is to say, deciding to declare this. If you declare it early enough in time, 1,000 years later, it'll become a venerated tradition. And so we have in the Jewish imagination, or in the historical rabbinic interpretive record, that Rosh Hashanah is more than the creation of the world, it's the creation of human beings. And that then puts the onus back on us to say, okay then, if in point of fact human beings were created on this day, then perhaps we can metaphorically recreate ourselves or begin anew, or imagine that because we're created in the divine image human beings are, that we, like God, can create, we can initiate, right? That idea. And it kicks off this penitential period whereby we have a list of things in our own mind that we could have done better, that we wish were different, and we can embark on that process also. So Rosh Hashanah is all of that wrapped up at once. The creation of the world, the creation of human beings, the opportunities that we have, and an awareness that with Rosh Hashanah, we're now embarking on a period of time that culminates with a Day of Atonement in which we take seriously the idea that we want to be different in...
And the birthdays of...
And I mentioned, and then over the subsequent centuries, after the idea that Adam was born on Rosh Hashanah, or that Rosh Hashanah actually celebrates Adam's creation or birth, there are traditions that say Abraham, the first Jew, also his birthday, don't you know, was on Rosh Hashanah. And not only that, but his grandson Jacob, also born on Rosh Hashanah. And so too can this be for you, the first day of the rest of your life. That's the idea. Jeffrey.
And other saints.
what's your question? Succinctly, so I can repeat it for the camera.
The question is, don't we have something that's not the same as Midrash, but we do have this other, kind of like the two lawyers, the sidebar thing going on with the lives of the saints?
Well, if Christianity does not have Midrash, don't we have something somewhat parallel in the lives of saints? I would say kind of at best. And a huge part of the Christian church, that is Protestantism, Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, Episcopal, doesn't really have that. We within the Episcopal tradition have it, but I would say reserved at a distance, kept safely at bay. We sing about them, we talk about them in a weekday service, but not ordinarily. Within Roman Catholicism, to a much greater degree, but it depends on, it's always a few saints in particular, Mary and maybe St. Francis and others. I would say not in any way comparable, and certainly not in the fullness. It's not as accepted completely as what Midrash is. But there is a certain function that does need to be fulfilled, and how we fulfill it is in, we would use the word incarnation, with certain foods and customs that gets wrapped around it. The custom that they have is, I'm saying, we don't really have that. And that's a really cool thing to make the scriptures. Often it is the case, let's go to the scripture and get an answer. It's a rule book. It's like that, they never, even though there is a list of rules in, say, Leviticus, I mean, that's literally what it is. Does the average Jew historically look at Genesis as a rule book?
No.
No. Christians often would. And yes, one would draw their morality from that book, but not as in a textbook that we go look to for the answer, but in the sense of the stories the people before us that were in relationship with God and what they went through is remarkably similar if you change some of the details. That's what all of Genesis we talked about last year. It's 11 chapters of kind of cosmic history, and the rest of the book is about this one screwed up family. Is that fair to say? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, Leah, and all the stuff that goes on there. And so living into that and imagining it is part of what Midrash is, and we don't quite have that, but to see it as this exciting, dynamic, still completely relevant set of stories is what I'm aiming for here. Would you say, I love learning this stuff because much of it is new. The choice of readings for Christmas Eve, what's the main reading we have on Christmas Eve? If you've been to a Christmas pageant, you should have some idea. The birth of Christ. There's what we call Old Testament thinking about ahead of time. And if you've, anybody ever heard the Messiah? There's stuff that we go back and read into the Hebrew scripture, the Old Testament. Look, that's Jesus predicted, or something like that. And then from you, O Bethlehem of Ephrathah, it's these old stories with a different read on them. And then it's always Luke about, remember Mary and all that in the inn. And then we take the story from Matthew with the wise men. How many wise men were there? Probably. We don't know, but they brought 3 gifts. And what's the story we get in Advent about announcing from the angel Gabriel about Jesus will give birth and Mary is a virgin, and you can't, those things aren't reconciled, so there'll be this miracle birth. So those are the stories we use. Rabbi, what stories do you now use, or did you originally use, for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur?
Okay, good. So let's remember that the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, God's everlasting love never dies, G-E-L-N-D, that's your mnemonic, or General Electric lights never dim, either one, G-E-L-N-D, and we read sequentially, the Jewish community does, from the beginning of Genesis through the end of Deuteronomy in an annual cycle, and the Torah is therefore divided into 54 Torah portions, which are read weekly in sequence. And then there are holidays that deserve or require their own particular reading, and so they're ripped from the headlines, as it were. We're going to read this reading for this holiday and this reading for this holiday. Now, originally, the holidays that were observed, the Torah portion or the Torah reading that was assigned to these holidays was the description of the holiday. On the first day of the 4th month, you shall gather a great assembly and blow the ram's horn. And from that, the services for that holiday were created. Yes? Or on this day of this month, there shall be no work, and you shall gather as a community and thank your God. Okay, so now we have a recipe for beginning of those celebrations. And then over time, various holidays were assigned different readings, precisely because, as we were suggesting, the room is full on those days. Right? You've got a captive audience in your largest numbers, and rather than simply reading, if you will, the textbook description of the holiday, we have an opportunity to read something that we want the populace to hear. Does that make sense? Okay. And so for Rosh Hashanah, the decision was made that we're going to read particular readings. Now, to understand this story, you have to know something else, and that is that while holidays are assigned to particular days, the first day of the month or the 14th day of the month for Passover, for instance, and Hebrew months are calculated on the cycles of the moon, the word would go out as to when the holiday should be observed. And the concern was that outside the land of Israel, where these decisions were being made, it might take some time to get that word out as to when the holiday is. And so in a better safe than sorry kind of way, the decision was made that certain holidays would be observed for 2 days, lest the information not be completely accurate. And so if you got the information, you thought it was Tuesday, but it's really Wednesday, in that way you'd be able to observe for 2 days and you'd get the holiday correct, which means we have additional readings for those second days. In about the 2nd century, 3rd century, as Christianity was starting to gain currency, the nascent church is coming into shape, the Jewish community, concerned about this exodus from the Jewish community, as it were, decided rather than reading the description of the holiday on Rosh Hashanah, different readings would be assigned. So there's a reading in Genesis that describes the arrival of 3 visitors who let Abraham and Sarah know that despite of her advanced age, she's going to become pregnant and bring a child into the world. That's going to be Isaac. That story from the Jewish Bible is then used in the Gospels, where 3 wise men show up. And also, they may show up after the fact, after the birth, but they're there to herald this miracle birth. This baby that by any lights wouldn't have come into the world, born to a woman who's beyond 90 years old, born to a virgin, and so we have a parallel there. So the decision was made that on the first day of Rosh Hashanah, we'll read the story about the foretelling of this miracle birth. And the second day, you come back and hear the end of the story, we have a story about Abraham being instructed by God to sacrifice Isaac. Genesis 22, if you remember the story. And so Abraham and Isaac go up the mountain, Isaac's put on the pyre, Abraham raises his knife to slit his son's throat and offer him as a sacrifice, and then God sends an angel, a ram, and Abraham is told not to go through with the sacrifice.
So why in the world would they pick that story above everything else to read on the second day of Rosh Hashanah? A child sacrifice story.
A child sacrifice story that's thwarted.
There's your key.
It was a refutation against the idea that God does want, and indeed requires, Christianity necessitates the death, never mind the resurrection, but the death of the beloved Son. And so this would have been understood in the 2nd and 3rd century, if it's read publicly within the Jewish community, as a way to say we reject that idea that's gaining currency, that's gaining popularity about this fellow Jesus who's God's Son, who is supposed to be sacrificed. And so it was for the next number of centuries. In most Jewish congregations today, those are still the readings. Now, because in Reformed congregations, liberal congregations, we don't feel a need to do the second day of the holiday typically, because we know how to measure time and we know precisely when a holiday falls. There's no reason to do Christmas on the 25th and the 26th, because we're certain when the 25th of December is. And so there's no reason to do that. The second day reading, which is the more dramatic reading, about Abraham being told to sacrifice Isaac and then having his hand stayed, is read on the first day, typically. And so it's been for centuries. And if there's any one story that most Jews will have heard read, because they come in greatest numbers on that day, it'll be that story. Now, to the contemporary ear, that story may be really troubling, particularly if it's the only story of all the stories in the Torah that's read on such a holiday. And so I made the decision in my congregation, both first in Philadelphia and then at Road of Shalom, and now we're doing it at Ohav Shalom, that we'll read the story of creation, the first story of creation, the 7-day story, because that's what the holiday's theme is essentially. And we're not interested in making a refutation to Christian theology, particularly given the amount of intermarriage in the community and the fact that we're not interested in defining ourselves against another group, but rather saying who we are ourselves, right? There's a wonderful teaching from Martin Buber that says, I'll do this twice at least, you have to listen closely. If I am I because you are you, and you are you because I am I, then I am not truly I, and you are not truly you. But if I am I because I am I, and you are you because you are you, then I am truly I, and indeed you are truly you. Does that make sense? You can do it again if you want. But the upshot is, if we define ourselves by what we're not, we're Jews, would you say we're not Christians, well, then I'm not being authentic to myself, and I'm not being authentic to you, right, by defining myself in negation to. And so the feeling that I had was that we should go back to creation story, because the idea of a parent believing that God said to sacrifice their child shows up too often in the news and their horror stories, and that's not the way to celebrate the new year any longer. This is my opinion. And so we go back to the creation of the world. But implicit in that celebration is all kinds of other beginnings and new ways of going. Okay, we talked about the readings. Let me say one other thing. We also have a theme that Jonathan and I have recognized has parallels and interestingly speak to each other. And we'll talk more about this on Yom Kippur, but we speak of a book of life. And that on Rosh Hashanah, as part of the liturgy, we say on Rosh Hashanah, it's written, that is to say, we write it into the book of life, who we were in the past year. And on Yom Kippur, it's sealed. That is to say, the book of life is closed for the season, and what's recorded there is now part of your, in parlance of school, it's part of your permanent record. There it is, it's inscribed in the book of life, who you are. Not who you intend to be, that's for you to figure out, and to maybe change who you were yesterday so that you can be better tomorrow. And the book of life looms as the record of all of our deeds. However,
interestingly, I also learned a lot myself about this recently. How many of you are familiar with the term, the book of life within Christianity? You heard it? It's in the Bible quite a few times. In the book of Revelation, about 7 times or so. Paul mentions in a couple letters. The idea comes up, and in, I would say, even more popular theology, it is a very big deal. Is your name written in the book of life? When I was a kid, when I did go to a Baptist church some, that was the idea. That was a shorthand way to mean something specific. And a mistake that might be made is to, even though it's the same phrase or term, book of life, what a Christian within a certain part of our tradition might mean and a Jew in a certain part of his tradition might mean are very, very different things. Even though it comes, and it's mentioned 2 or 3 times in the Torah.
no, book of life doesn't show up in the Torah.
Doesn't show up in the Torah. Where does it show up?
In the liturgy.
In the liturgy. That's interesting. That I did not know. So within Christianity, it occurs only in the New Testament, or originally I should say in the New Testament, and then it gets expanded. So when we say your name is written in the book of life, what does that suggest to you? You are awesome Episcopalians, I've got to say it that way. Not that, well, somebody's paying attention to you anyway. It kind of comes off as God is like Santa Claus with his naughty and nice list, except at a cosmic eternal level. Is it fair to say, to a degree, that's what it is within Judaism?
Yes.
Does God, in Judaism, the idea of the book of life, is there a book in which all your good and bad deeds are recorded? Kind of?
Kind of, metaphorically, yeah.
It's kind of like an old-fashioned accountant's ledger. Imagine a massive green book. I've in my mind, I know you don't have this guy, St. Peter, sitting at a giant desk with a book, and he's got a pencil behind his ear and a green accountant's cap and a lamp, and he's writing down all your good deeds and bad deeds. And in Judaism, what's the idea? Do you want your good deeds to outweigh the bad? Probably. Sure. Most of us do. Our good deeds, just like Santa, unless you get a bag of coal. What happens if you have more bad than good within Judaism?
It's not good for you.
It's not good for you. Is there a particular specific consequence? Do you get damned to hell forever?
No.
Oh, guess what? In Christianity, your good never will outweigh your bad. That's part of the deal. And that's this whole theology I'll get to in just a minute behind that. Your name written in the book of life means that you are granted entrance into heaven. And if your name is not in the book of life, according to Revelation, you will be in a lake of fire. Make that noise louder. That's the sound of eternal wailing that just happened there. Why? By the way, just a little sidebar. Why in the world would lake of fire? Why is hell? Anybody know? What was the garbage dump outside of Jerusalem called back in the day? Gehenna. It's where we get the idea of hell. So think of all the ritual impurity for a Jew: dead bodies, trash, animal parts, blood, everything ritually or other impure is out there burning in a lake of fire. It's the worst possible thing you can think of. And it's I've heard so many stories when I came here. The air is so great here. Back in the day, men would have to take 2 business shirts because it would be soiled and the street lights were on. We were hell with the lid taken off. What was that expression? Hell with the lid off. It's very effective that you get this image of, oh my God, this was a dirty, sick place. And I tell you what, when I moved here, wow, Pittsburgh is so dirty. I come here, it's like, oh, it's not at all. But the image that sunk in for a very long time was, it's this. And maybe there was truth to that, a lot of truth to it. But we take these ideas, and so the idea of hell or a lake of fire comes from a burning garbage dump outside the city, which is about the worst you can imagine. And people had a connection to it, a familiarity to it. Anyway, so you don't want to be there, do you? Well, the answer is, heck no. I want my name in the book of life. So within Christianity, it's that I'm one of the elect. I'm one of God's chosen. I am, you'd put it in Baptist or evangelical parlance, saved. And within the Christian faith, do you have good in you? Yes, but. It's a no but, so that's kind of Christian too. Well, go ahead.
Where does the forgiveness of sins come in?
That comes in later, because the basic idea from very early on, one could argue this is scriptural. It absolutely comes from Augustine from the 4th century and certainly later on. There is, the old prayer book said it so well, there's no health in us. It sounds beautiful. It's a terrible idea to me, but it sounds beautiful. That, Allison, you are so sweet and dear and wonderful. However, you are a sinner rotten to your core. Oh, and so am I, and so are all of us. That's heavy Presbyterian or Calvinism. There's no health in you type of stuff. And if you've experienced it in the Catholic Church, there's a different way of expressing it, but it's a similar idea. There is nothing anyone could ever do to merit, earn heaven. St. Paul, this is his basic whole argument in Romans, or you could say all of Paul's writings. There's not, while you're all created in the image of God, absolutely. Everybody's created good, absolutely. But from birth, by natural selection, by choice, by transmission from Adam and Eve down through generations, or our own actions, most likely, that we are removed, segregated, separated from God and need to be reconciled. There's this gulf of sin, and sin is, in Judaism, is it fair to, is more actions you've committed? In Christianity, it's actions like mortal sins, adultery, lust, and so on. But it really means a state of separation between God and humanity. So the whole point of all this is you can't fix it. You can't pay your debt. And we use all these really interesting mixed metaphors and images of legal, like judicial stuff. We use buying, freeing of slavery stuff. Redemption, sanctification, reconciliation. There are all these different images kind of get thrown together. And the very basic, and this is like a year's worth of theology class in 2 minutes. God has to do the saving. And God sends his only son, same story like Isaac there, who's perfect without sin. And that's the atoning sacrifice. Where did they do the atoning sacrifices, Rabbi? Pre-rabbinical age in Israel.
On the Temple Mount, which is now the Temple
The
Mount.
temple. And there was blood sacrifices. So when we say Lamb of God, and you remember all these stories, we'll get to this at Easter. Jesus is in Jerusalem, where all good Jews would go to, on the feast of the Passover. What's the Passover?
The Exodus from Egypt?
Exodus from Egypt. And what specifically, we're supposed to mark the lintel, the door frame, with blood, so the angel of death passes over you. And so they're all remembering this deliverance from slavery to become more God's people. And they're all there in Jerusalem doing that. And so there are all these sheep everywhere to serve as Passover lambs. And Jesus becomes the new Passover sacrifice. So the perfect offering once offered for all is a classic way to say that. So you don't have to repeat it. That is, Jesus fills this very interesting Jewish role of sacrificial lamb, scapegoat would be another way to express it, stand in, fill in, takes our sin upon him, so we're then reconciled to God. That doesn't exist within Judaism. It exists within Christianity. And we have this so Book of Life becomes a totally different thing, even though it's the same word. So if you're in the Book of Life, you have been redeemed in Christianity. And within Judaism, it's referring to what specifically?
The record of all of your activities. It essentially functions as your permanent record, right? You get a bad grade in a particular year in school, it's on your permanent record.
I look at my folder back in 3rd grade, Allison. Oh my God, seriously? That's always there. In Judaism, they kind of get, well, we're not that great in this era, so we have to look back for the merit of our ancestors. They were better back in the day. I read that and I thought, I just read Genesis? Those are not great people. Yeah, it's my wife, but no, it's really my sister. Or I'll sacrifice my son, or we'll throw our brother in the pit. Like, it's one horrible story after another. I wouldn't want any of these people as relatives, let alone friends. But those are the merit. We remember, everybody gets remembered more fondly in death. That's part of what's going on. But those are two very different ways of looking at this whole thing of there is merit in our ancestors. And we would say that to a degree, but that's how the sanctification, the reconciliation, God overlooks the bad because there's all this stockpile of good. Thank heavens.
The notion, it's important to make this distinction. If I understand what Jonathan is explaining for us, that the Book of Life in the Christian idiom, you're either in the Book of Life or you're left out.
Yeah.
Whereas in Judaism, the notion of the Book of Life is your ongoing record. And you have an opportunity between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur not to erase what was recorded in the most recent months, but to repair for it, or to repent or atone for it. That's the idea. And it's your permanent record. It's with you. Whatever mistakes you made in the past are with you. We don't have a focus, Judaism doesn't have the same focus on eschatology, which is to say the world to come. We have those ideas, but the notions of heaven and hell and purgatory and the rest are really much more Christological. Judaism had to answer in response or dialogue with this philosophical, theological current, such that we have ideas about it, and Judaism has what to say about it. But if you ask most Jews, or the average Jew, what Jews believe about heaven and hell, they'll be completely flummoxed. Because while they're familiar and conversant with those ideas, because they populate our cultural idiom, oh, for heaven's sake, or thank heavens, we all understand it, whether or not we believe in heaven and hell, right? Or we use the word hell in a certain way. Well, we understand what that's referring to, but we may have as much of Dante's Inferno in our imagination as we do with anything that's biblical. Jews tend not to deal with those ideas. It's not the carrot and the stick, or it's not something that we have to strive for. It's interesting, if I understand what you're saying, is that it's not that you can work hard enough to get into heaven. Everyone's going to fall short of heaven, but for God's grace.
All have fallen short. All have sinned and fallen short. The whole idea, that's the right word, grace. So St. Paul in the argument in Romans, and again, we're talking about not just Episcopalians, Baptists, Catholics, everybody. Grace is God's immersive love. And it operates whether we participate in it or not. Faith, this oversimplified, faith is our response to God's grace. God's first action is us responding to that. And we can't save ourselves. It's God doing the saving, but that we participate in that. In our tradition, we would say that baptism would be a major way we do that, sharing in the Eucharist, community life, and so on, a way we participate, respond faithfully to God's grace. And a big part of the Christian church, Baptist evangelical, the emphasis is much more on the next world. We talk about that too, of course, but you need to get people saved. And so it becomes very otherworldly, as to be a Christian means to be saved, which means I accepted Jesus in my heart through some type of prayer or words, or it's almost a transactional relationship. I don't mean to cheapen that, but that's the focus of that. So even within Christianity, like there is in Judaism, there are lots of branches that fly off from there. But the big piece of grace is there is no way ever to merit salvation, heaven, whatever, Messianic age. That has to be initiated and done by God, and then we participate through faith, responding as we receive that. Once I didn't know what love is till Jesus loved me, and then I loved him back, is an old-fashioned Baptist-y way to express that. We got a couple more minutes. Let me ask you a question. There's this really great site called My Jewish Learning, which has lots of helpful information. Think of it as a better developed Wikipedia for Jewish stuff.
MyJewishLearning.com.
MyJewishLearning.com. What is something you wish you had done differently in your life this year? So think of this as like a New Year resolution, and how would you do it differently? That's a lot of the introspective questions. What is a significant event you or your family have faced? How did you do that? Deal with it? How was God a part of that? If you had a do-over, what would you do? So the idea is try to do better next time, this upcoming New Year. Is that right?
That's right.
Do we have something like that in Christianity? Kind of baptism promises, kind of Lent, but not really. Advent's a new year, but it's a totally different focus. Lent, we're introspective. Yes? People do confession. Do you have confession within Judaism?
Personal, I mean, it's...
I was hoping you'd put in a good word.
I can only do so much for you, Allison, but I will put in a good word, yes. We have a point we didn't really bring up. There is, certainly within Christianity, there's private confession, and by that I mean not to a priest, between you and you praying to God. God, I'm sorry, I need to do better, I wish I hadn't done that, or however, whatever you say. And there is, the old-fashioned term is auricular confession from a person to a priest. I have heard confession here numerous times, like, oh, you do that? Yes, we go in the chapel. There's a form in the prayer book we use. I never will talk about that under any circumstances. I cannot be compelled to. Only unless you threaten your own life or the life of somebody else can I repeat anything. I just say, we talked, or I heard confession. Many people find that extremely helpful to do periodically. And then you think of a general confession, and what's in the prayer book on page 360, most merciful God, we confess we have sinned against you. We do that as a community every week. Is Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur about private, individual repentance, or is it communal, or both?
That's a great question. So we'll get into this more next week. Everything we say publicly on Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur is stated in the first person plural. that we have sinned, even as one takes responsibility for him or herself. Right? So it's a personal moment, but it's shared communally such that we shouldn't be able to say, yep, I remember when you cheated. Yep, I remember when you were false in business. I remember when, right? But rather we share it because we're all guilty of it, and arguably we're responsible for each other, and that kind of, we could expand that idea. One last thing, and then we'll wrap it up. The word Shana, Rosh Hashanah, Rosh means head, like that which is on top of your neck, right? And Shana means year. So Rosh Hashanah is head of the year or new year. But the word Shana also means change in Hebrew. And so in a significant way, it's a classic sermon, that when we wish someone a Shana Tova, a good year, we're also, if you will, wish them good change, or a new start, or a new beginning, or that which you're working on about being a better version of yourself. We wish you well with that. Because that ultimately is what it means to be a human being, ideally, is that we're working on self-improvement and being a better friend, a partner, a family member, a citizen, right? That's our task, to work on self-improvement constantly, and we can encourage each other in that way. So that's my last coda, is that when we wish each other Shana Tova, which is the wish for a new year, and John and I were saying you can do that for the next 10 days or so. Sort of, it's a sociological thing. How long after someone's birthday can you wish them happy birthday? Until it's, that was last month. You're a little bit late idea. Right? The wish is there. So when we wish each other Shana Tova, which you can do for the period of time, we're also encouraging people to appreciate that the change you are embarking upon, the work that you're doing in your own life, may it go well with you.
So, Shana Tova, everyone. Thank you.
We'll see you in a week.